Hey everyone, so I'm Sean Miller. I'm one of the TAs for CSE 335 this semester. And so in this video, I want to talk about how to create games with the Sprite Kit in Swift. So we could create games using the storyboard in Swift, but there's a lot more features that we can use using the actual Sprite kits in Swift. And so I'm going to start by showing our game, my example game that I created, and then we'll go through and talk about how to actually create that. So we'll start with a menu that just has some basic instructions, and our goal is to just keep the rock from ever hitting the ground. And so we're going to click anywhere to start, and then just bounce this rock off of our paddle. And then when it eventually hits the ground, it goes to a game over screen and displays our score. So going into the game, the way we'd create this is similar. We go to new project or file, new project, and then instead of choosing app, we're going to choose game, and we're going to follow those same steps. Now, when we go through that, we're going to start with a storyboard, which we're actually going to leave that storyboard completely empty, because we're going to be using game scenes instead of a storyboard. And so storyboard and game scenes you don't usually want to mix those. And so going through the game scene, this is what we're actually going to be using to design our game. And so I have a game scene here for our main menu, which you can see the outline a little bit better. And so the outline here is this rectangle here, is what our actual view is going to be. So if we want to set that to a actual square, it'll always display as a square no matter what the size of the screen is, as long as it's smaller than the screen. And so on this main menu, we just have a bunch of label nodes, and these are just text. And so going to the main menu, the actual code for the main menu here, we don't have anything in this did move method. That ends up just being a initializing method. And since there's nothing we really need to do for this home screen, we can just leave that initializing method empty. So the only other methods we have here are touches began, touchdown, and update. So those touches began and touchdown are standard whenever you create the game scene, or whenever you create a game, they'll be in the game scene method, along with a few others. And we'll get to those others when I go over the game scene code. So the touches began is going to be when the user initially clicks on the screen. And so when they click on the screen, it's going to call this touchdown method. And on this main menu, when they do touchdown, then we're going to check to see does this file exist? If it does, or we can set the scale mode so that it fits the window, and then we will present the scene. And so there's two types of transitions, and this is the one I'd recommend, as it's easiest to use. So going to our next screen here, we have the actual game scene for the actual game. And so in order to add stuff here, we'll do it similar to the storyboard, just with the plus in the top right. And there's a lot of different things we can add. Now for most of this, I used color sprites, which are all those red rectangles. And then I used a couple of labels, like for the score over here. And then for the rock up here and the player right there, I actually used art I created. So we have just a black rectangle there and a kind of rock image here. And so in order to add art that we created, we're going to go to Assets, and we'll see here that we have the art and so you can just go right click and then click import, and it'll let you select any images there. And then we can just add them to the game scene by clicking on this middle icon here and selecting any of those. And so whenever we use those art, they're going to become sprite nodes, just like all these color sprites are, while the score is going to be a sprite label. And so while still in this game scene, one of the big things I think is really interesting about the Sprite Kit is the physics that are enabled with the Sprite Kit. So when you saw in the initial running of the game, the ball bounces pretty high off of the paddle, and the paddle doesn't move at all. And so looking at the physics of the ball, we're going to use an alpha mask. where on all of these rectangles here, we're going to use a bounding rectangle because that's what they are working as. So we don't want the ball to rotate just because since it's not a perfect like sphere, it will the rough edges can make the bouncing go pretty random. So we could allow for that and make it a little bit more random just for simplicity. I left it so it doesn't rotate, and we don't want to do it pinned because if we do make this pinned and then we run the game, what's going to happen is that rock is just going to be pinned exactly where we left it, so it'll never actually move anywhere on the screen. So we should see here when I start the game, rock is just never going to move. We can still do this, but that rock will never move. And so going back, some of the other settings we have are we have this variable here, which is ultimately how bouncy it is. And so if we run it with that variable, and that's a 0 to 1 scale, and so if we put that at 0, we're going to see that this ball is just not going to bounce at all off of the paddle. And so here, and yeah, it just drops down and falls. It just doesn't do anything, and then it'll fall. And so that's not what we want for this game, since we want that ball to continuously bounce up. So we're going to set that, we're going to leave that at 1. One of the other really cool variables here is the mass. And so right now I have the mass of the paddle set to a very high max value, and then the mass of the ball set to almost nothing. And also with the paddle, I don't have the physics as dynamic. So that means the physics ultimately aren't enabled, as they're just going to be static, so it's not going to move. So let's say we were to set this mass to 1, and we were to run this. Now what's going to happen is, and so it's also not affected by gravity, and that's another thing to point out here, and we'll see the effects of that. So when the ball ends up hitting this paddle, it's going to just go down. And so now the paddle's gone down and it's just up against this bar there. And so you couldn't actually see it anymore, but it just kept going down until it was right up against this bar here. So we're going to change that to not be dynamic, and even with a mass of 1, with the mass of 1, but the physics not being dynamic, this should just stay at that same position and not fall down like it previously was. And so see, we can see the paddle there is not going to move down because the physics are static. And so the last major physics part of this I wanted to point out was the initial velocity here. So you have the initial velocity in both directions, and so we can just set these to whatever we want to give them initial velocities. And so for this one, we want it to be going, I set it at going down at somewhat of an angle, where the paddle shouldn't be moving at all. And so that's the majority of physics, and there's definitely some other ones, like the allows for rotation would let the ball just start rotating randomly, which could be useful in certain cases. And there's also some nice like graphic stuff with the lighting here, and the lighting and shadows and different things like that. So now when we want to actually use these nodes in our code, we need to make sure we give them names. So all these rectangles, since I'm just using the physics over here, and all these rectangles are pinned and I just left them with standard settings. We don't need to name those because we're not actually going to use any of these rectangles in our code. But what we do need to name are anything we're going to use in the code. So we're going to detect a collision between the ground, which I called the bottom, and the ball. We're also going to detect collisions between the ball and the player, and we're also going to move the player, so we need to make sure we can name that. And then the score is right there, so we need to make sure we can edit the score, so we're going to name that. So now that we have all of those named properly, we're going to go to the actual code for our game scene here. And so in our game scene, we're going to create a variable up here for each of the um, variables that we intend to move or change in any way. So out of those 4 we had, the only one I didn't create a variable for was the bottom, because we're not going to be moving or changing that at all. And so in this did move function, this is going to be our initializer, and we can see that it's only going to run once by putting a print statement in here. And so it'll only run that one time because it is just an initialization method. And so what it's going to do, and let's check to make sure it is just running once. And so we can see it runs once, and it runs every time we transition to the screen. So we're going to ultimately say if there exists a sprite node, or in the scores case, sprite or SK label node with the name, player, ball, or score, then we're going to assign the variable we created, the variables up here. We're going to assign those values of the sprite nodes that we got here to those values up here. And so now that we have those, we're also going to set the label text to be whatever the score is, just so it actually has a score there instead of just saying label. And so now here's the function we're going to use for collision. So this did begin method is going to be used is going to be called whenever there's a collision between 2 points. And so this contact is going to have a lot of different variables, and you can see all of those by just typing contact and then putting a dot. And you see there's a lot of different variables here that you can use and explore to figure out what you could do with them. And so I'm using body A and body B. And so I'm looking at the variables of body A. And so these are just going to be sprite nodes. And so one of the things we have to do is try to figure out what these sprite nodes are. And so I used the description and just said if it contains the name. So on this first if statement, it's saying if either of the body A or body B contain the words or the name bottom, then it's going to end the game. So this is going to be a transition here to the game over screen, which I'll go through the rest of this code and come back to this transition. And so the other one here is if either of them contain player. And so if it does contain player, then we're going to increase the score by 1 and then change that actual label on the screen to be that new number. And so now going to how to actually detect what the user is doing. And we saw this touches began here. And so that's going to call this touches down. And so all we're doing in all 3 of these methods is moving the paddle to whatever position they were touched or moved to. And so all these methods are just going to call whichever one of these it belongs to. And so touches began is going to be when they initially touch down. Touches moved is going to be if they hold their finger down and move their finger. And then touches end is going to be when they let go. And same thing with touches cancel. They're just slightly different, but nothing too much to the detail. And so then this update right here is going to call every time it updates the screen. So that's going to be your frames per second. And so it's going to, for the most part, be right around 60, maybe just under, depending on how much stuff you have going on. And so if you wanted to, let's say, keep track of a score based off of time, you could use this function and then acknowledge that it's going to be roughly 60 times a second to update it. Maybe you want to increase the score every second, so you can have a counter that goes up once it's 60, reset, and add 1 to the score. And so now I'm going back to the transition here. So we have the transition here, and so one thing I did was I didn't create the game over screen using an actual game scene. I just created it all in code. And so this transition is going to work better if you're creating those game scenes just entirely with code. And so you just create the game scene, give it the size that you're currently using. I pass the score in right there, and then I just present the screen. So now going to the game over screen, this one does get a little bit complicated in this initialization method because we have to go through and create each of those variables instead of creating them in the actual game scene. And so I print game over, which you can see prints out right there every time we go to that screen. And then so all these are going to be labels because we just have text everywhere. So I set the background color here to just a gray, and then I create a label with the text score equals and whatever that score we passed through was. And then I create a point on which we're going to actually put that score on, and then go through and set the position and font color, and then just repeat this process for the end game over label and the click anywhere to play begin label. And so once we have all those created, we have to actually add them as children to the game scene. And so we can see that this extends the game scene, so it is an object of the Sprite Kit scene. And so we can just do self.addChild and add each of those. And so finally, and this is just taken from the main menu, because we just need to transition to the game scene. We're just going to use that same transition. And this transition is going to work better if we're using the actual game scene, which I'd always recommend to use the game scene because this gets really complicated, especially if you have anything more than just text. And the transition we saw in the game scene, this one right here, is going to be better if you're just using your code to build the game scene. And so the final thing here is the view controller. And so the view controller here, and we're not going to mess with it too much. And so the only part we actually want to mess with, and I mean, there's a couple things like a lot of these, I think it automatically fills the should auto rotate to true. You can see that this is just a view controller, and so you can set that to false if you don't want your game to automatically rotate. And since our game scene wouldn't look too normal if it was to rotate, I set that so it does not automatically rotate. And then the other thing here is the transition. And so this transition here is just going to be what your starting screen is. So if I set this to the game scene and run that, it's going to start at the game scene method and just never actually go to that main menu. So yeah, we'll see it just automatically starts at the game scene instead of main menu. And so one of the other cool features about this is we can actually show how many nodes there are on the current screen and what the frames per second is. And this can be really helpful for making sure you don't have like 100 of one node that you just accidentally copied too much or anything like that happens. So down here in the bottom right, you can see the frames per second and the nodes. And so yeah, once the game starts, like I said, it's going to be right around 60. Depending on what's happening with the game, it'll bounce around from a little over 60 to a little under 60. And the more stuff that happens, the lower the frames per second are going to go. And so eventually we'll end the game, and our frame per second is going to be right around 60. So yeah, so that's the general overview of the Swift Sprite Kit. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me or come into my office hours. And thank you for watching.